Well, good morning, friends and colleagues. And first of all, let me thank Villanova and Roberto, for introducing me so warmly. But particularly, of course, to Barbara for all this punctilious care she has shown for all her visitors, and to Erin for this wonderful team that looks after us. I don't think we reproach her that she doesn't run a successful bus company. And she is rather preoccupied with her daughter's confirmation this morning. Now that's my thank you. I also have an apology to make, which the friends from Drexel, Philadelphia, that I overnighted with, said, well, surely you're bringing an apostolic blessing for the Villanova Wildcats.
Really well.
And I said, no, I didn't pack it. But, yeah, we sure she will. So, what I'm going to do is a fragment, a real fragment of Pope Francis's works. Because, well, I think this sums it up probably better than anything. When we have a meeting, I'll tell you about the academies in a second, very briefly. When we have a meeting, we usually end up at the Sala Stampa, the press office, and there's no rare journalists who are interested in that particular theme, and they ask you for sort of anything they please. That's the press. But they asked one day, about a year after I've been president, kind of how do you find working with Pope Francis? And I said, well, the amazing thing is, if Papa Francisco hadn't wanted to become a priest, he could have been a great sociologist, an ethnographic sociologist. Why did I say that? I certainly wasn't, one of those grovelling compliments one passes. It was because specifically, each visit he makes, and I think he's made 26, is it, to different marginalised countries, each visit he makes, he picks on something as a major problem. He picks on it, he brings it back, he doesn't forget it, and he asks those of us who do that kind of thing to investigate it, document it, and make recommendations about it. And that actually hit the headlines, the Pope, it was translated as, the Pope should have been a sociologist. I think that would have been a great loss to the world, but he certainly could have been. So I think, to put this in context, because it's not just that the social doctrine of the Church, as you all know, is its best kept secret, it's that very little is known about the work of the academies. So there are two academies. There's our elder sister, much our senior in every way, PAS, Pontifical Academy of Sciences, we would say natural sciences. And then we are the junior, PAS with two S's, created by Pope John Paul II in 1994, and we've been learning ever since, and we've still a long way to go. Now, the key thing about both academies, and we work very closely together, as we did over climate change. I was amazed when they asked several of us to come to the Paris meeting, December 2016, where the Paris Accord was eventually signed. I said, well, what do I know about climate change? You're the climatologists. And they said, yeah, but it's the social implications. And yes, I took that point, and I've always thought disciplines grew like topsy and one shouldn't respect the boundaries too closely. But the natural scientists are very punctilious about this. They'll tell us the science, they'll tell it very, very clearly, beautifully presented, but they'll stop like they've hit a brick wall when they come to social implications of it. So when we're in Paris, as you know, the Vatican only has observer status at UN events. As Jeffrey Sachs was saying yesterday, 193 nations were represented in Paris, and we, our little group, half of whom were responsible for early drafts and parts of Blood Out of Sea, we were visited by 100 exactly national delegations. So, well, I hope we were useful. It says something about the way in which these academies are influential. We very, very rarely make press headlines, unless we say something that's sort of snappy and memorable. But it does filter through. And you can tell in the US of A, don't take this the wrong way, but you can tell it by the amount of hate mail we get from the ultra-right. That's my best index of it. So, well, to begin at the very beginning with the story of human trafficking, there's one morning I was in Mexico, sitting there having my espresso on the terrace for breakfast with my iPad open, and there was this email. This was in the fall of 2013, and the email said, Pope Francis has just appointed you president of FAS. I thought I'd better have a second espresso before I did anything else. And, you know, the message gradually sank in. And, of course, you say to yourself things like, what should we do that's of use to the church and the world? And as Robert mentioned, I've been there from 1994 onwards. So I knew the usual routine, which is that you write a highly polite letter to the popes. I had my 3 popes, got them by then. And you say we want to be of service, but it would help us in planning our activities to know which themes and topics you think are ones that the social scientists can most usefully tackle. And for John Paul II and Benedict XVI, yes, we got replies which said basically, thank you for your work, carry on trucking. Which is not exactly what I call directional guidance. Quite the opposite with Pope Francis. Now, let me get this right, because I was hoping I'd have a clicker. No. Where has our technology phone gone to? I'll just do that. Okay, thank you very much. So this was quite different. We got this the next day inside the Vatican in Spanish, written on the back of an envelope. And we treasure that as a relic for us in the future. In translation, because it's not very clear in projection. I think it would be good to examine human trafficking and modern slavery. Organ trafficking could be examined in connection with human trafficking. Many thanks, Francis. And we were thrilled, not because we knew the first thing about human trafficking, we didn't, but we had a direction given to us for something that he considered useful. And that is our main raison d'etre. We are not part of the Curia, 2 academies, for which we are heartily grateful. It gives us autonomy to respond directly to the Pope, who appointed me, and I'm directly responsible to him. So we can pretend the Curia hardly exists. And its problems are not our problems. So we began a series of meetings. The first one, is it showing it better to you than it is here? Good. The first one, we thought, well, we've got to know things. We've got to start with what's the best empirical evidence we have about the extensiveness of human trafficking. The statistics are awful. Don't place any credence on them at all. Okay, so just click there. That's perfect, thank you. So we got together the police chiefs, Interpol, Europol, and some from nation states. The guy who was looking particularly sombre in the foreground is the Spanish, or was the Spanish police chief, and he shared with us some sort of amazing uses of technology, of how if an unidentified boat comes into a Spanish port, they can use long-distance thermal imaging to see what's in the hold, that is underneath the waterline. And the thermal imaging can detect the difference between boxes of contraband of various kinds and human people. Well, if it just picks up 2 images of people moving around, obviously there could be crew seeing that the cargo hasn't shifted or whatever. If they see 100 packed bodies or more, then immediately they suspect something. I'll go into a bit later on the differences between trafficking and asylum seeking, because this is a major problem. But that was the start of something you may have heard of called the Santa Marta Group, which is made up of policemen and bishops. Don't ask me about the sociological dynamics. They do mainly work on criminalisation and I don't quite know what the bishops do there, because it's an all-male body. At least my country has made rather a problem for them, because it's just made Cressida Dick the first head of the police force. Well, they can't exclude her, so maybe we have a more inclusive body on the way. Now I better make this work. No, let's jump one. Solve these problems. Yes, so two academies are beginning to work together. We do a lot of joint activities, but I've illustrated that. And these came to the head. And you can see how fast we're working. It's now only April 2014. And already we're producing this meeting, which became a book, Sustainable Humanity, Sustainable Development. And that was very important. It was not saying climate change is what causes trafficking. Trafficking has probably existed forever. Well, so has climate change in a sense, but not the Anthropocene. And that has been quite important throughout, because those people, members of the general public, who really don't want to get into the climatology. It's not that they're climate change deniers, they just don't want to sort of get their heads around it. But they can understand things like desertification, drying up of the fisheries as a source of livelihood, and the human misery that comes from that. Now, as I said, the link is tenuous, because if that happens in your particular area, threatens your particular livelihood, particularly if it's one of the developing countries, what do the people do? Well, they are not done anywhere. What they do is move. They move to somewhere where they hope they can find an income. And that usually means a town. But as people cluster in any of the big towns throughout Africa, really, you get this periphery of shantytown dwellings at best, made out of cardboard boxes and plastic and so on. There's no employment. There's a huge impetus for them to be dragged into gang warfare, drug dealing, etc., etc. That's the connection. It doesn't explain causally the whole phenomenon of trafficking, because so far in what I've said, nobody has been trafficked, they've just moved. But it leads on from there because there seems to be a generational biography of the people who are now the high-tech bosses of trafficking. These are not the guys that you see on the boats or you police can pick up and put in the courts. They're operating some digital facility somewhere that can track people down, point of origin, point of destination, meaning the control center. Don't overdo this, it's not, it's not 100% accurate or anything, but what it has done, and I find this statistic, both horrifying, but much more telling than the numbers count, is that trafficking now is something through which you earn much more money than drug dealing, drug trafficking. And this trend, which involves a point of departure, often involves the sale of human beings. And I think this is why, very gradually, we've been able to change or expand the objections to trafficking, the attempts to eliminate trafficking, across the board. It is a humanitarian concern. It's not a specifically Catholic issue. I'm sure there are many religions that regard it as, a terrible sin to sell a fellow human. But that's a strength. We shouldn't regard it as a weakness. We try to clutch this to ourselves and say, this is our big Catholic deal. No, it's as open as we can make it. I'm sorry about this compulsive water drinking, it's because I've got the remains of the cold. So, towards the end of 2014, we decided that probably the best thing we could do would be to think about the different constituencies on which human traffic impacted, and to try and gain the support from these different groupings. Now, one thing that Pope Francis did of his own initiative, was to use the youth days as a major gathering of young people. I think that's taken on Copacabana, and to get them to sign up, as it were, against trafficking. And they have been very powerful in this, both at the sending end, the informing, and at the receiving end, again, informing to a different kind of authority. That was followed up by a joint meeting of religious leaders, signature of a joint declaration, and just like all the social encyclicals, the key thing about this declaration is that it was addressed to all people of goodwill. And that includes any kind of faith community, the big one that one can think of. It includes what I gather you call in the States the nones, those who say they have no religion, because it is a humanitarian issue that can have humanitarian justifications. Now, that led us to realise that in a lot of the world, there is not a huge understanding of what precisely trafficking involves, and it can involve different things. The basic differences between smuggling people, now I have every sympathy for the asylum seekers, but most of them have raised quite a big sum to get on these ramshackle boats, many of which sink in the Mediterranean, and therefore I suppose technically it is a voluntaristic action. Yes, there are many contextual factors that induce them to do something as desperate as that with their families, with young babies that have actually been known to be born on these ships, and the terrible graveyard that is Lampedusa, that the Pope went down and threw a reef onto the sea to commemorate those asylum seekers who had died in escaping everything from torture to destitution. Trafficking, on the other hand, can involve the sale, literal sale of people, like old-fashioned slavery, and the picking up of drunks at night, and they wake up next morning and find that they are on a boat going somewhere and are about to become forced labour. And this confusion hasn't helped the cause of abolishing trafficking. Now, Pope Francis got quite a lot of flack when he used the term modern slavery for trafficking. And I've written an article that justifies his use of it, largely through hooking up with, by happenstance, one of my old classmates at the London School of Economics, who many years ago became Professor of Sociology at Harvard, Orlando Patterson. And some of you will know he's written one of the best and biggest books on the varieties of form that slavery can involve from ancient times right up to the present. And that was fairly important because there was a tendency at that time for there to be a lot of opposition to calling this slavery, modern slavery. I'll come on to some people who have been trafficked and try and just illustrate in bullet points how close they are to the ancient forms of slavery. So we're trying to get our act together still at this stage. That website, by the way, is still very alive and active, so you can just Google it. Hashtag End Slavery. Then we had our 2015 plenary meeting. That's the most formal picture you'll ever get of the Academy. I think that was when security was particularly troubled about Pope Francis just wandering around the courtyard outside Domus Santa Marta and presenting a potential target to whoever had strayed in. So there we are, all of us equally uncomfortable in one of these magnificent meeting rooms. But the importance of that meeting was that we then did begin to zoom in on three things, I think, in particular. Defects of the national law. The law is truly terrible, even if a country like my own, GB, UK, has such a law. It is appallingly put together. It's like the pieces of a jigsaw that don't interlock. And so people are left in various kinds of statutory forms of limbo. They can't move forward with their lives. They can't have the right to remain. They can't have the right to work. And they have 45 days in which they are remaining in a safe house there used to be a website that was called Day 46. And what happens on Day 46? If time is up under the law, it says exit, and the traffic people are out on the streets and dependent upon whatever fate befalls them out there. And one of the things that was happening was that the traffickers themselves were re-trafficking precisely the same individuals. That was point one. Point two was that apart from the voluntary sector, and that remains much the same today, that is the best help that trafficked people get after 45 days. And what we call it a postcode lottery, I guess you'd call it a zip code lottery, what charities, voluntary organisations exist in a particular area. Because most of the traffic folk don't know the geography, how can they? We wouldn't if we were dumped in Lagos tomorrow morning, most of us. So their fate is just left hanging in the wind. And thirdly, and this is particularly true of Europe, let's not underestimate xenophobia. There is a huge resistance. This is what brought about Brexit. We hate foreigners. In fact, we hate foreigners more the less of them that we've seen. That's an interesting sociological point when we got into action itself, that xenophobia is on the whole something that's exercised against collectivities of the unknown. It's not exercised against particular individuals. So that we ended that meeting saying we have a motto: resettlement, not repatriation. Because that is the ultimate threat that European governments hold over the trafficked individuals. And, of course, since an academy is made up of academics, there was the book to follow. We've got everybody from the UN, the ILO, the EU, all the experts are in there, as well as anybody else who's worked on that. It is genuine open access. If you want that book, you can download it for free via Google tonight. Or if you want a hard copy, you just write to the Academy and you'll be sent one. So we've reached the point where we ask ourselves, and we ask Pope Francis in particular, so what comes next? And this is where things really do hot up. So just note the date, 28th April 2015, and that Ban Ki-moon, thanks largely to the help of Jeffrey Sachs, came to our lovely Casino Pia Quattro and addressed us both about climate change and about human trafficking. He was extremely supportive personally. He was also extremely cautious as Secretary General at the time. And he said, look, these guys have fought over the draft and they would kill over a comma. These are virtually his own words. But again, sociologically, it showed something very interesting, that instead of the church as a social movement, and that's what we are as far as human trafficking is concerned, as far as that's what we're considering, then a new strategy has developed. The old strategy was, if you want to make a major change, you work through national governments. Well, if you think about from the States to the end of the EU, the Baltic republics, you're not going to get much change out of that. So, again, this is an innovation of Pope Francis's, that we don't work through the national governments necessarily. If they're willing to join us and help us, great, but we're not reliant on them. We work with the parallel associations, structures of influence that are represented by the INGOs. And that avoids a reliance on national governments to be as against human trafficking as we are, and B, it saves us from the bad relationships between certain local national governments getting in the way of the trafficking issue. So a lot of that fighting goes on in the UN. It doesn't go on in the Vatican. And that's a wholly good thing. So, again, strategically, we start thinking about the different constituencies. And in particular, about the big city mayors, the people who will have to administer a resettlement policy for trafficked people, who secondly will need to define what decent resettlement provisions entail, and who thirdly will have to discover what works, what helps to integrate them. Now, we could have gone on in that way, just picking off constituency after constituency, if we hadn't had received this remarkable boost. Only 2 months later, scarcely that, we find that Ban Ki-moon had visited the academies, and Laudato Si, as you well know, had its effect on climate change, but there are sections of it that are equally opposed to human trafficking, and therefore, you can see this was a hectic summer. By August, the final text of the new Sustainable Development Goals was to be produced by the UN. Well, the night of the 21st August was absolutely incredible. We didn't go to bed. The Chancellor and I were on the phone, on the email, texting, anybody we could think of who might be present at the UN. And then the most amazing breakfast when there was 8.7, and there are others, but this is the one that really puts it all together, to take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labour, end modern slavery, note they've adopted the term modern slavery, and human trafficking, and secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labour. Well, we were just as buoyant and as happy as we were to be at the end of the year when the Paris Agreement was signed. But, of course, that raises the question of where next? It's one thing for the UN to condemn it. It's one thing to have the SDGs, which are very useful, but where do we go next? Well, these were the targets that we sketched out. First of all, a meeting of the high judges from all sorts of different countries, and they were extremely enthusiastic in tidying up their own law. So we had a judges' summit with its declaration. This picture just captures how enthusiastic it got. So the Pope only got round to signing the declaration on the roof of his car, which is what he's leaning on, before the meeting was over. And he did it smiling. You can see he's grinning his head off. He's happy. We certainly did go on from there with meetings at other constituencies. We did quite a bit with the help of Francis Delmonico on organ trafficking. But, and I should be concluding on this, shouldn't I? Or did we start late? Tell me, Robert, what? I should wrap it up. Okay. No, I'm going too far. So we've got the car roof right. There's this inspirational message that was given, well, you can see when, but it's something that in his daily homilies, usually, most often, at the Domus Santa Marta, that Pope Francis had said many times, every parish, every religious community, every monastery, every sanctuary in Europe, take in one family. And that really did say something to me personally. A lifetime spent writing 43 books. Yeah, where's the action? And so I thought, he says, every parish. Let's see what my home parish can do. And so there's an article I've written called Starting from Zero. How do you first of all convince your home parish that this is a good thing to do? My own is a very middle class, in some senses it's an excellent place for trafficked people. It's got a very low crime rate, it's got loads of green spaces and lots of local facilities for sports and schools and so on. But it's just white, it's a sea of white faces. And people actually turn around in the street and there's a black face. No, they've got beyond that, just. But it is, sort of WASP territory, if you like. And I bought a little house and called that the basis of the parish project. After a lot of argument with the parish priest, agreement that the parish finance committee would pay their utility bills and council taxes if the council wouldn't waive them. We still don't know 18 months later I'm still getting bills, for $2,000 that I owe them, technically. Well, we'll see. Now, one of the interesting things was we certainly didn't try to evangelize. We certainly said to them, you might well like to see the parish church that's supporting you financially, and from which the volunteers, all of us, came. Not that we're excluding anybody else, we hope to spread the model to other churches and any other voluntary associations of humanitarian intent. But we said, yes, come and see your supporters. People were very nice. And this is one of the outcomes. So the 3 children of the 2 women, one who had been in domestic servitude from the age of 9 and had not been allowed by her traffickers to attend school. She brought up their kids instead. And the other who had been in prostitution. So 2 children, legitimate under Yoruba law, Nigerian Yoruba law, one of the main tribes, and recognised by the British family courts. And he's there in the picture. I haven't pictured either of our young women because I think they are still at risk. They have no right to remain. They have both been turned down multiple times by the Home Office as trafficked persons. And I think they're very glad that they're be able to give and receive from the parish church a membership for their children. They were rooted. This baptism was particularly important. It was the normal meaning of baptism, but it was also being rooted in the country that they were living. Will always be there on the certificates. So that is really towards the end of the story, which I could go on with about for a long time. That's the last meeting that we've held on this. The idea was to put together people from many denominations and some who are none, and try and be honest with one another about what worked and what didn't work. It's a very nuanced issue. You can't go in there and lay down the rules. You have to lay down some rules about fire hazards and, health and safety. But you don't tell them how to behave, what to do, how to pass their day, what's suitable reading or television watching for their children. Much as I would like to say switch it off. And actually I do, because I cannot compete with, to have a conversation about the next judicial appeal, with cartoons flashing away and noisily zapping one another in the background. But it hit me last night, and so I'll end on this because I think it's going to be important. Everything seems to get drawn into this. We hadn't got a motto for our little charity, but I found it last night. At evening prayer, thanks to St. Thomas Villanova, charity is not just giving, rather removing the need of those who receive charity and liberating them from it where possible. Our aim is to just extend what is possible. Thank you very much.
Questions? Comments?
So, yeah. Do you want the ribbon light?
Wonderful. I have a question about persons who may not agree with what I would call maybe slavery. I have a very close relative who was captured, held in a Middle Eastern country, through the divine intervention, was allowed to leave, but he was the only person on the airplane flying to India who was not in shackles, because apparently there's some kind of accord where if a person is in prison or assigned to jail in some way in India, that person can be flown out of the country and basically, to my way of thinking, slave labor in a Middle Eastern country. Do you have any difficulties with some of the Middle Eastern countries agreeing or not agreeing with what human trafficking and modern slavery is?
Yeah, very good point. I mean, perhaps the most crucial point, because at least as far as Europe's concerned, if we could have had, a pan-European, an EU agreement on resettlement practice, we would have known, they would have known, everybody would have known where we were at. Instead, we have a patchwork of provisions that are often maximally ambiguous, and the one thing that indicates how significant this repatriation is something I saw on the doormat of our little 3H, as we call it, charity house, and it was turning down one of the young women, saying that she did not have conclusive grounds in law to having been trafficked. That was one piece of paper. Bulky envelope like this. What was the rest of it? It was saying, first, with the threat, in view of this decision, and unless you do something within 14 days, another appeal, we will remove you. What a charming word for fellow human beings. We'll remove you like removal vans for furniture, unwanted. And, well, that is the state of affairs. There are many, well, you've seen the recent elections that have taken place in the Netherlands, in Austria, in Britain, unfortunately, etc., etc. And it's growing in France. Well, it's almost institutionalized. The Front Populaire, Marine Le Pen, has actually changed its name. But if there is an opposition party in France, it's her party. These are xenophobic parties. The United Kingdom Independence Party was a single issue party. Get rid of these foreigners. They didn't care whether they were asylum seekers or trafficked people. In fact, that's one of the great barriers of, I'm not trying to divide them or anything, it's one of the great barriers in getting coherent assistance for trafficked people, who actually, and this is a reason why their numbers are so very hard to come by, if you compare them, this is what I'm talking about, non-joined up legal so-called logic. If you compare the length of time that an asylum seeker who is accepted as a legitimate asylum seeker can stay, it's 5 years. A legitimate trafficked person, somebody who can sustain their legitimacy, it's 3 years. The financial benefits are different. They're much more advantageous for the asylum seekers than they are for trafficked people. I simply cannot understand that. The one thing you can say about asylum seekers, and I'm certainly not saying it against them, is that they weren't sold into it. They may have been driven into it by all the horrific things, pictures you've seen of Aleppo and so on television. They may have felt they had no alternative to it. But even all of those very sad things are quite different from selling a human body and soul on some market. Takes you back to before the 150 years when we so-called abolished slavery. So yeah, it's a problem. Yes.
Well, thank you very much.